Hiromi Higuruma, character from the hit slice of life anime Jujutsu Kaisen and legal defense counsel for any and all wrongfully convicted individuals, Higuruma is one of the most overpowered characters in all of Jujutsu Kaisen. He is best known for his feat of convincing a jury that the one and only Sean Diddy Combs was in fact innocent of all crimes. When asked for his opinion on Higuruma, Sean said that this was all according to plan and then ominously jumped on the back of a four-winged pelican and flew to Tel Aviv, Israel. Some of his abilities include, but are not limited to, stopping his opponent from using their curse technique, stopping his opponent from breathing, and stealing the love of the woman in their life and turning them into a fan account on Twitter. But let's dive into what makes Higuruma so powerful and why he's captured the attention and respect of so many Jujutsu Kaisen fans. Hiromi Higuruma is a character introduced in Season 3 of Jujutsu Kaisen. The reason for his late arrival being attributed to the fact that he is a part of the individuals living in Japan at the time that Kenjaku activated his remote idol transfiguration on many sorcerers and non-sorcerers throughout Japan to kick off the Culling Game arc. At this point, Yuji and Megami have gone off to Tokyo Colony No. 1 to find Higuruma and use his 100 points he's accumulated from killing other sorcerers in the Culling Game to try and save Megami's sister Sumiki, as well as trying to find a way to end the Culling Game. Higuruma wasn't a Jujutsu sorcerer beforehand, and at this point in the story his powers have only really been active for about a week at most. That being said, Higuruma is literally some kind of super genius who is an extremely fast learner, and at this point he's already become the equivalent of, or potentially even higher than, a grade 1 sorcerer. He has 100 points by the time we first even hear of him, which means at the very least he's killed 20 people. Considering there are roughly 100 people in each colony, Higuruma's pretty much putting up like prime ninja Tifu numbers here. His technique is similar to Hikari in the sense that it is almost entirely reliant on his domain expansion, but before we get into his technique, let's give a little bit more of a backstory on who Higuruma is. Higuruma was a lawyer in Japan before he became a sorcerer, and he primarily seems to have taken cases with clients who were wrongfully accused of crimes they did not commit. He had the talent to be a money-hungry big shot lawyer for corporations or whoever he wanted, but he had an inherent ability, in his own words, to be unable to avert his eyes from justice. He makes a point of saying that the Lady Justice statue, common in a lot of places that represent the justice system, is blindfolded. This is usually supposed to signify the justice system's impartiality and lack of bias, but in Higuruma's eyes, this actually represents the ignorance of people to the truth and to real justice. Higuruma says this is why he will always keep his eyes open, even if he must do it while standing completely and utterly alone. Alrighty, this guy's character makes no fucking sense because a real lawyer would never say that, but I digress. Higuruma would always fight for the wrongfully convicted, even if it meant he was practically guaranteed to lose. Because of this, he is extremely overworked and extremely underpaid, which is why he often has that signature depressed, bored look to him that all the LARPers have decided makes him worthy of being their profile pic for the next 6 months. Anyway, one day Higuruma is given a case where a young man is accused of a crime of murdering a mother and a child in their apartment. Though in reality he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he only fled from the cops because if he was questioned, they would have discovered he had a cat in his apartment with a no pets policy in his building and the cat may be killed. Higuruma believed him and was able to convince a jury that this was a misunderstanding and they had the wrong guy. But thanks to the prosecution filing an appeal, a second jury has hit the client, and unfortunately this time they weren't so light on him. He was convicted, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison. Higuruma did everything right and the man was innocent. And yet, to Higuruma's horror, the man is somehow convicted, sentenced, and looks at the only person he trusted with disappointment as he is taken away to prison. This causes Higuruma to snap. Rightfully so, awakening his curse technique at the very moment he walks in to demand a retrial from the judge and prosecuting lawyer, which ends in him killing them both. I don't know if there's any way that Kenjaku could have done this intentionally, but I think it's a very interesting twist of fate if not. Now let's talk about his curse technique because it's actually pretty badass. Higuruma's curse technique is based around that of his career in the legal system and therefore is dependent on his ability to prove his opponent guilty of a crime. It starts when Higuruma casts his domain, called Deadly Sentencing. Inside of it, non-violence is forced upon all parties caught in the domain. There's also a Shikigami present in the domain by the name of Judgeman, and this Shikigami is who both parties are required to argue their case to in order to win the case. Then an accusation is made toward the opponent that is a random event that occurred at some point in their life in which they committed a crime. And it's Higuruma's job to prove beyond unreasonable doubt that the crime was committed and that the opponent is guilty. Higuruma's not ever on trial, and he isn't ever cross-examined or anything, so I think it's safe to say that he's probably safe from all danger in this encounter. His opponent, however, is only given the crime, the date, and their participation in said crime. They don't know what the punishment for the crime is or what evidence has already been collected for the case. Higuruma is also given an envelope which has some form of evidence inside of it. The contents of this envelope are unknown to everyone inside the domain, including Higuruma and Judgeman, until Higuruma opens it, which he's only able to do after his opponent has pleaded their side of the case. This is the only real evidence that's ever used in the domain. We don't see anyone who's trapped in it ever use any evidence except for what's in the envelope, so it seems that the goal is to come up with some sort of defense that is fairly vague as to not accidentally supply the courtroom with with conflicting arguments from whatever the opponent says and whatever the clear evidence is in the letter. For example, when Yuji fought Higuruma, he was on trial for illegally entering a pachinko parlor while underage, and his defense for that was he only entered the pachinko parlor to use the bathroom, admitting he entered the parlor but saying he didn't illegally gamble. However, after he pled this, the envelope was revealed to have CCTV footage inside that showed Yuji at a cash exchange counter. So story didn't really add up. Yuji could have gotten out of this by saying he had never heard of or seen the parlor before, as the footage only showed him standing at a cash exchange counter, which is often a separate entity and even in a separate building from the parlor altogether, but he proved himself guilty by admitting he entered the parlor. This outcome, or a guilty verdict, results in a couple different outcomes, seemingly related to the severity of the crime. In this case, the punishment was confiscation. Confiscation is where the opponent who is convicted as guilty has their ability to activate curse techniques stripped away. So, if someone like Gojo was convicted of, stealing the slippers of Megami that one time, he'd likely lose his ability to use Infinity, Blue, Red, or Purple. I think he'd still be able to use his domain because it's more of a barrier imbued with cursed energy than a curse technique, but I could be wrong on that. I really try to understand the way cursed energy works in this show, but I have trouble on occasion because I can't actually read. Anyway, confiscation takes away the ability to use cursed techniques, but not cursed energy. However, in Yuji's case, due to his lack of innate curse technique, he is cut off from cursed energy entirely instead. Higuruma is also gifted a gavel which he can change the size of on command as a weapon which does significant damage to Yuji to the point where he is almost defeated. But this has some pretty interesting hypotheticals. Like, for example, how would confiscation work on a heavenly restriction user? Could they even be targeted by the domain at all? I think there's a possibility they could be targeted and they'd lose their physical prowess if convicted, essentially becoming normal and therefore completely fucked, or that they not be targeted by the domain at all. But I think it's a lot more likely that they would be targeted, but confiscation wouldn't be a viable punishment. Instead, the domain would default to a different punishment, such as the death penalty. This is where Higuruma is given a sword of pure light called the Executioner's Sword, in which striking the convicted opponent with it once results in said opponent's instantaneous death. These are the only two punishments that have been shown on screen, but who knows, maybe he can use like tungsten ballsack or come in mouth too. The Executioner's Sword is just a straight up one tap. There's no counter for it and there's no way to avoid it. Is what I would say if Gege didn't love Sukuna, because he actually did find a counter for it and somehow was able to cut off his arm at the exact moment, avoiding any damage the Executioner's Sword would have done to him. And somehow Gojo couldn't see World Cutting Slash coming. I don't even know anymore, man. However, it's also important to note that Higuruma's domain expansion does not only go off of what is true, but it goes off of what is told to Judge Man.
It's not what you know, Clyde, it's what you can prove in court.
We know this because when Higuruma and Yuji had their fight in the second domain expansion cast by Higuruma, Yuji admits that he committed the crime of mass murder in Shibuya on October 31st, 2018, despite Higuruma noting afterwards that Yuji was in fact entirely innocent of said crime, as Ryomen Sukuna took over his body without Yuji's consent and did these acts against Yuji's wishes. Just because Yuji admits he committed the crime doesn't mean he actually did. However, because of his refusal to argue in favor of the truth and believing he is at fault for something he didn't do, Judge Man sentenced him to execution anyway. I think this is a really interesting detail because it means that, technically speaking, if you're a good enough lawyer, you can probably convince Judge Man you're innocent of anything, which means you can nullify any of the negative effects from Higuruma's domain. Just because something is true and there's near undeniable proof that it happened, if you can convince Judge Man that you didn't do it, you can probably walk away scot-free. Obviously, we've never seen this happen, and I think that because it didn't, we shouldn't assume that it's possible. But I think it's an interesting hypothetical. I think that's because they just didn't want to write out a fully fledged court sequence, and also for the fact that most of Jujutsu Kaisen's characters are complete fucking morons, but I digress. I think Higuruma is probably the best character that's going to come out of Season 3, at least from a storytelling perspective. His motivations are extremely understandable, and he offers a perspective on the world that I think is really missing from a lot of the characters in JJK. Not like we really need more characters in the show who have political messaging, or that it should become a commentary on the state of the world instead of a battle shonen, but it doesn't hurt to have well-written characters that we can relate to real-world problems every once in a while between our power scaling and agendas. There's really a lot to be said about his struggles as a lawyer, trying to do what's right rather than what makes him money, and he's clearly a victim of circumstance that just wants to help justice prevail, but is stopped from always being able to do so by the system that is supposed to protect the innocent. But I still think Hikari is my personal favorite character, and I can't wait to see him and Kashimo have their fight later this season. Speaking of Hikari, if you're completely lost on how his technique works and want to understand just how he gets so lucky all the time, check out this video I made explaining his curse technique and skill set, because let's be honest, I know you're not reading those subtitles quick enough to know what the fuck is even going on as it is, so...
How the fuck you want me to listen to all this and read this shit, bro? Listen to me! Listen or we're gonna die!
You're probably gonna need an explanation. After all, I wouldn't want to have to make you, read something for once.